Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin, and we'll be talking about a new theory of how the universe works and how different forms of life evolve. Our guest is Rupert Sheldrake, a plant physiologist from England who spent time as a research fellow of the Royal Society and as a faculty member of Cambridge University before traveling to India in the mid-70s, where he developed his revolutionary theory, which is described in his book, A New Science of Life. Welcome to Infinity, Rupert. In layman's terms, what is your theory?
In essence, it says that the form of species, of animals and plants, their shape, and also their behavior, what they inherit, is given by a kind of collective memory of the species, by a process I call morphic resonance. And this differs from the conventional view in that it's saying that they all, as it were, tune in directly to previous members of the species and pick up the actual form that they had and the kinds of things they did, what they learned, for example.
What is specifically different about this theory from the general theory of evolution?
The usual theory is that inheritance takes place through information coded in DNA, the genetic material. What I'm saying goes very far beyond that. This is a very radical break with the conventional view. It's saying that the DNA is indeed important in inheritance, but most of the things that shape and mold the behavior of organisms are determined by what I call morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields. The difference is most clearly illustrated by analogy with a television set. If you think of a TV, and if you're trying to understand the pictures on the screen, to get those pictures, you have to have three things. You have to have the energy going into the set through the plug or from the batteries. You have to have the right components of the set, transistors, condensers, resistances, wires, and so on, all joined up in the right way. And you have to have the transmission that the set is tuned to. The pictures on the screen can't be understood just in terms of the components of the set and the way they're wired up. Sure, if you take away components, the pictures may disappear, or it may go onto a different channel if you mess around with the tuning circuit. But this doesn't prove that the pictures are coded within the components. The components are necessary for the pictures. Change the components, you can change the tuning, different pictures may appear. But the pictures are not programmed inside the components. What I'm suggesting is that the DNA, this regular genetical material, which gives rise to proteins, is setting up the right components in living organisms that are like the components of the TV set. You need those for the right tuning. But the information that gives rise to the form and the behavior is coming through the morphogenetic field, which is rather like the invisible transmissions that the TV set picks up. If you change the genes, you can change the tuning, so you get genetic changes. Like changing the tuning channel of the TV set, you get a tune onto a different channel. But that information is not contained within the condensers and resistances in the tuning circuit. So that's the difference. Regular biology is, I think, trying to understand the pictures on the screen, as it were, just in terms of the chemistry and arrangement of the components of the set.
If we were to take a caveman and bring him into modern society and turn on a television set, it would be very difficult for the caveman. If we were to explain it, we might be able to explain that changing the selector button of the channels would change the image that's there. But it would be very difficult for us to explain the concept of the transmission, that there is in fact a tower somewhere that's sending out this invisible transmission which is decoded by the receiver. How then can we, again in layman's terms, how can we translate this concept of the morphogenetic field? Where does that come from? Where does it originate from?
What I'm suggesting, you see, is that if you're dealing with the morphogenetic field of, say, a cat, that the transmitters are past cats, that it's coming from cats. It depends on the form and what they do, their behavior. And that this cat is picking up on what previous cats have done. The previous cats are the transmitters. And whereas in radio and television the transmission goes across space, in what I'm suggesting it goes not only across space but across time as well, so that you can have connections from the past to the present, which is what makes the whole thing rather like a cumulative memory. So all members of the species would tune into the, as it were, the memory of the species. And not only would they tune into it, but they'd also contribute to it, because what they do, how they behave, would feed back into this memory and would influence future members of the species.
Are there archaeological finds that would suggest that, and I know that in the discussion of evolution, one of the strange mysteries is that similar things seem to happen in time periods in vastly different parts of the planet. Different species evolved simultaneously on other continents. Your theory would seem to make more sense out of that than the traditional DNA evolutionary theories.
Yes, I think it does. I think there are a lot of things like this, simultaneous developments in cultures, and also parallel evolution. For example, in Australia, the marsupial mammals have formed parallel types, marsupial wolves, marsupial mice, marsupial anteaters, and so on, which parallel placental mammal forms elsewhere in the world. This has often puzzled people. I think there are a lot of these anomalous facts that present biology finds it very difficult to handle, that would become much easier to understand on this theory.
How many members of any given species does it take in order to get this transmission strong enough to have an impact?
Well, it's not an all-or-nothing thing. I'm suggesting that the more there are, the more firmly fixed the habits will become. If all the members of the species behave the same way in the past, and the more often they behave that way, the more rigidly fixed these habits will become. It's saying in general terms that nature and animals and plants particularly run in grooves of habit. The species are running in grooves of habit, and the more often things are repeated, the deeper the grooves get worn, so the more likely they are to repeat what's been done before.
While you were in India, you were involved in what kind of work specifically?
I still work in India in an agricultural research institute where I'm involved in improving Indian food crops. There's an international centre, and I work as a physiologist on the staff.
What kinds of experiments or observations led you to this, the theory that you're...
It doesn't directly come out of my agricultural work, which is very applied, but it comes out of the theoretical work in biology that I got interested in while I was working in Cambridge, and out of a general philosophical interest which I've had for a long time, since I studied philosophy at Harvard. The experiments that are most revealing in this context are ones which come from animal behavior. In particular, there are some experiments with rats that show just the kind of thing that I'm suggesting. These experiments have already been done in a long series of experiments, started at Harvard in 1920, so they went on for 25 years, these experiments. The experiments are interesting because they illustrate the principle of the theory quite clearly. The theory says, you see, that if you train an animal like a rat to do a new trick, then if it learns to do this new trick, it should make it somewhat easier for rats all over the world of the same breed to learn the same trick more easily. And the more rats you train here, say in San Francisco, the easier should it be for rats everywhere in the world to learn the same thing. So one can easily design experiments to test that. I mean, it's such an unexpected prediction. I mean, existing theories certainly wouldn't lead to that expectation. But the experiment I'm referring to was actually done. It wasn't done to test this hypothesis I'm putting forward, because of course this hadn't been put forward at the time. It was done to test another idea about the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The idea that children, offspring, might pick up on things that parents had learned through a kind of genetic transmission. The experiments involved rats put in a water maze. They had to swim out, and if they got the wrong exit, they got an electric shock. The first generation of rats made well over 200 errors. Their offspring made only about 200. Their offspring made about 180, and so on, and there was a progressive improvement in the rate of learning. This was not explicable in terms of genetic selection for smart rats. This was ruled out. People didn't believe these results at first, and they were then repeated elsewhere in the world, in Scotland and then in Australia. And what was found was that the rats elsewhere in Scotland and Australia learned much quicker than the American ones had done first time, possibly, I think, because they were picking up on the experience of the American ones. And as time went on, not only did rats descended from trained rats get better and better, but so did all the rats of the breed that were tested in different parts of the world. There seemed to be a general improvement in this, and this was a big improvement. The rats, after 10 years, were learning 10 times faster than the first lot. These results were never explained, and they've been hanging around in the literature of rat psychology for decades, really, without having been explained. This was one of the longest and most comprehensive and thorough series of experiments ever performed with rats, and I think they provide rather good evidence for the kind of thing I'm talking about.
If, in fact, this happens, have you given considerable thought to how physically it happens, how we could physically explain it? Is it something that is the field generated from those rats, a kind of an electromagnetic field that goes out into space somewhere and is available to be absorbed by future members of the species?
They're like existing fields of physics insofar as they're fields, these morphogenetic fields. But they're not the same thing as the existing fields of physics, none of which could have the kinds of properties I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting, in essence, is a new kind of field. Actually, it's not just me that's suggesting it. It's within the realm of biology. The idea of morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields, has been widespread for at least 60 years. This idea is, in fact, currently used in embryology textbooks, and it's quite a common term. Biologists have found it necessary to develop this concept to try and deal with the facts of embryology, the coming into being of form, and the facts of regeneration in animals, whereby they can, and plants, where they can make up for damage and repair lost parts. The idea is that these fields shape or mold the developing form and help mold the regeneration of that form. The only problem is that no one's been able to say what they are, and attempts to explain these fields, which are already accepted in biology as a concept, in terms of known fields have not been successful. And I think one's driven to the conclusion that we're dealing here with a new kind of field. And I'm suggesting that these fields have these very surprising properties, a kind of non-locality in space and time, so that they lead to these very surprising and unexpected kinds of connection among members of the species.
I think there's a theory somewhere about, and I don't know what the proper name for it is, but a sort of a time belt that exists in space that records everything that was every thought, every word, every action, every growth, every birth, every death. And it's there, and it's permanently encoded, and it's just kind of passing by all the time, and that certain individuals have the ability to tap into that time belt. Does that coexist, that sort of thinking, with what you're suggesting?
Yes, I think one kind of concept like the one you've just mentioned is the idea of the Akashic records. It's something that turns up, for example, in theosophical literature, and it's derived from Buddhist theories, Tibetan Buddhist theories. There are some of this kind. The idea of a kind of cosmic memory. Yes, it's similar to that. It's not saying it quite in those terms, but it is suggesting there is this kind of basic memory principle built into life, and not only into life, but also into non-living things. I think the same thing would apply to crystals and molecules, even atoms. In essence, what I'm saying in the most general terms is that the laws of nature, the things that govern the regularities of this world, are more like habits than fixed laws. What happens in the universe depends on what has happened before and how often it's happened. Some habits, like the habit of the hydrogen atom, have been around for so many billions of years that they've become so fixed that we get the impression that they follow timeless laws, changeless laws. But these might just be very deeply entrenched habits. When we're dealing with new things, new habits acquired by living organisms, we can study this process of habit formation by experiment. But with long-established ones, we get the impression of fixed laws. So in general, I'm suggesting that there's this kind of habit principle in the universe, which is rather like these ideas of memory you refer to.
What are the possibilities for the theory in terms of human life? Are there any experiments that have been done in psychology or biology, physiology, that would suggest that human beings are in fact on this affected by habits over time?
I think there's a great deal of evidence that suggests this sort of thing happens. One is the evidence from psychology of the kind carried out by C.G. Jung. And you know Jung had the idea of the collective unconscious. And Jungian psychologists, who are after all large numbers of them, many therapists are based on that kind of training, have the idea that all human beings are connected up by a kind of pooled species memory, which contains the memory of patterns of thought and patterns of myth and so on, archetypal patterns that we inherit from the past members of our species. Now, this idea of the collective unconscious is very similar to the kind of thing I'm saying, and what I'm saying ties in perfectly well with it. The only thing is that in Jungian psychology, this thing is regarded as being operative at the level of human psychology. I'm suggesting that it's operative not only in human psychology, but in the whole of nature. So what I'm saying is that there's a very, very much more general principle of this kind. But there's already considerable evidence from the study of dreams and myths and so forth that there is this kind of interconnectedness in the subconscious levels of human beings. So this is psychological evidence which is consistent with this kind of approach. I would also suggest that it should be getting easier and easier for people to learn things that other people have learned before. For example, it should be getting easier to learn to ride the bicycle, because lots of people have already learned, or learned to drive cars, or learned to program computers. Now, I think there's some evidence, it's difficult to pin it down exactly, but it seems to be fairly well accepted that kids, on the average, now learn bicycles rather easier than their grandparents did, for example. There could be many factors at work, better bicycle designs, more motivation, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, there are lots of things where there has been this kind of improvement in human performance. Records in sports events are another case in point where we've got very detailed information. And, you know, year after year, records keep being broken. We see this improvement going on in almost every kind of sports event. And it's not only the winners, the extremes, who seem to be getting better. If one looks at the data, it turns out that the sort of average performance has also been improving in many events, in competitive athletics, for example.
I'm going to try to see if I can't get you to do something that most scientists are reluctant to do, and that is to place a good or bad label on it. A lot of habits for humans are good things, positive things, if we would judge them, the athletic performance sort of thing. But a lot of things that people have learned to do through time, through modern history, are what we would consider bad things, killing other human beings. There have been a lot more human beings killed at the hands of other human beings in modern history than there were in ancient times, maybe because there are more people. Is that also the sort of thing that, you know, are you, I guess I might better ask, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the human race based on the theory?
Well, it certainly would say that bad habits would propagate like good ones, and the kind I've thought about most is not global ones like wars, but things like smoking cigarettes, things like heroin addiction, things like alcoholism, these patterns of behavior. I'm suggesting that if people start doing these things, they'd get sort of sucked into a habit which would depend on influences coming from the past, from past people who've been in that habit, which would make it easier to fall into that kind of habit. And I think these syndromes of behavior, some of which are very bad habits, some extremely destructive, do indeed propagate in this way. So there's nothing in this hypothesis that means that only good habits will propagate. Bad ones will propagate too. When we come to wars, killing people in wars, then we're dealing not so much with behavior that comes from individual habits, but rather a behavior that comes out of collective habits of societies. And it's possible that the hypothesis applies at the society level. But it's an area that I haven't speculated about much. I prefer to keep closer to the biological facts and possible evidence. I do, however, think that it does mean, if this theory is true, that there's a much greater degree of interconnectedness among people than we've tended to assume on the basis of conventional theories. And intentions, peaceful intentions or hateful intentions, may indeed go beyond the mere mind of the person who's having them and the kinds of overt plans for war that they may be formulating. They may have a much more disturbing effect in ways that are much more subtle and unexpected than we at present think of. About the future, I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I veer between both points of view. It's obvious that we're in a moment of great crisis at the moment. And if we don't make certain kinds of decisions to try and reduce the nuclear arms race and increase the level of trust between nations, I think the outlook's very gloomy indeed.
Could you describe the 100th monkey theory? What is that? How does it work?
The 100th monkey effect, which is a well-known thing in a lot of recent writing, really comes from a book of Lyle Watson's, Life Tide, where he describes some experiments carried out in Japan, where monkeys were trained to, monkeys learned to wash potatoes that were fed to them, and this behavior spread through the colony. The story, as it's popularly related, then goes that monkeys on other islands started doing the same kind of thing. This behavior spread. However, it's not quite as simple as it's often made out to be. First, there's no evidence that it had to be 100, that 100 learned it. It was a kind of slogan that Lyle Watson made up, which was caught on, but it doesn't have to be a particular threshold. The kind of effect I'm suggesting would build up progressively. It wouldn't necessarily pass a threshold where nothing had happened before that, and after that all of them would do it. So that exaggerates this threshold thing. The other thing is that the evidence for that particular story isn't particularly good, and I don't actually use it in my book. I prefer to use evidence from much better documented experiments, like the ones with rats. However, the 100th monkey story, the idea that behavior spreads to other members of a species because it's been learned in one place by members of that species, is in fact the kind of thing I'm saying, yes.
Do morphogenetic fields only operate within members of the same species, or is there an interconnectedness with other forms of life? We've talked about all forms of life and maybe crystals and elements and other things being subject to it, but is there an interconnectedness that goes beyond the boundary of species?
The process of morphic resonance that I'm talking about is not one that's all or nothing. That the finest tuning, the biggest effect would be within members of the same breed or race within the species, and then you'd have a general effect from the species as a whole. And there might be some effects coming from members of the genus, closely related species, but the effectiveness would fade out the more different things are. It's based on similarity. So members of related species might have some effect, and it's possible you could have cross-specific connections now and then, but the main effect would be from within the species.
Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the founder of Transcendental Meditation, once suggested that if 1% of the world meditated, there would be no possibility of world war. What do you think about that?
I find it difficult to know where he's got the idea of 1% from. It's based on the idea that we're all connected up psychologically, which I certainly believe. But this idea of 1% seems to be rather arbitrarily invented.
Like the 100th monkey?
It's like the 100th monkey. I think it's a kind of slogan. Certainly, I think that if enough people were able to go deeply into themselves through meditation and analyze motives and get out of particular destructive habits, and particularly the habit of building up an image of bad guys out there about to attack us and projecting it onto the enemy. And as we in the West project this kind of image onto the Russians, and they have exactly the same kind of projection onto the West. And this kind of habitual response, which forces people into these hostile postures, is obviously what underlies the arms race. Certainly meditation might help in overcoming that, but I doubt if, I don't know that a 1% effect would really work. Well, if Maharishi Mahesh Yogi persuades 1% of the world's population to do it, we'll be able to see. I hope he does it.
You talked earlier about habits, and I'm thinking that habits, good habits and bad habits, are most easily reinforced in groups. If you're a smoker in a group of non-smokers, it's easier to quit because no one around you smokes, and the cigarettes aren't as available, you don't see other people smoking, and the habit is easier to break. Would that suggest that the positive things, the positive evolutionary steps for mankind could better be achieved if people of like mind all gathered together in some place, if high spiritual leaders all went to India and invited all the people who felt the same as they did to come and join them?
Not necessarily. What I'm suggesting, you see, is that this influence depends both on influences from other members of the species and also on the tuning in process. Think of a TV analogy again. You see, if one channel started broadcasting it with a much more powerful transmitter, say channel 7, suddenly it got 4 times as many transmitters, which were each 4 times as powerful. It doesn't mean that everybody tuned onto other programs is suddenly going to get nothing but channel 7. It means that if people tune into channel 7, even from further away, they're more likely to pick it up. But it doesn't mean you're just going to bludgeon everybody into hearing that one channel. It's not going to stop the others. And I think that in order to pick up these kinds of influences, there has to be a kind of tuning process in people. And it's certain kinds of influence, if a lot of people are involved in them, if groups are involved in them, might be much stronger influences. So if people tune to that, they might more easily pick it up. But that tuning has to come from within, as it were. I mean, that's a matter of free choice decision. Whatever it is that enables us to make decisions about our lives, to tune into one wavelength rather than another, as it were. That still remains up to the individual. Greater and more powerful beneficial influences coming from groups here and there can certainly help, but the tuning will always remain an essential part of it.
Will then, in nature, there always be the monkeys who don't wash their potatoes and the people who just don't get with the program? Popular cliche.
Possibly. I mean, among wild animals, then you don't get such a wide range of behavior anyway. So you don't get many sort of bees that don't collect pollen, and you don't get many dragonflies that don't fly, and so on. I mean, most species are highly conformist. Now, among people, there's a much wider range of behavior, and it's very difficult to generalize from biology to human behavior. So I don't think we have any reasonable parallels from nature here.
Where do the people who excel come from, and the animals? Where does the first monkey who washed the potatoes come from, or the Einsteins of the world?
This is a very deep question, and it's one that the theory I'm putting forward throws into sharp relief, because really, as you see, it's a theory of repetition. It says once something's happened, a new thing's happened, it will tend to be repeated, and the more often it's repeated, the easier it'll get to repeat. It doesn't answer the question of where the first one comes from. And to answer that question, we really have to step outside the area of science. I think science in general deals with the regularities of nature, the repetitions of nature. Scientific laws are about regularities. When we come to the question of origination, of creativity, the first cause of anything, we're in an area where I think we leave the realm of science and we have to give answers in terms of philosophical theories. The materialist theory denies that there's anything beyond nature, denies the existence of God or the existence of, say, mind in nature. And therefore all creativity, according to materialists, has to be ascribed to chance. There's nothing else that could explain it. So chance, with a capital C, is brought in as the kind of deus ex machina, the thing that solves all the problems that nothing else can solve. Chance is the god of the gaps of the materialist. If one doesn't adopt that theory, one could say there is a kind of mind in nature, a creative principle, inherent in life and inherent in nature, inherent in the earth, and inherent in all living species, all living things. And that this mind-like creative principle is responsible for innovation in living organisms and in people, and the kind of inspiration, the kind of influences that creative people often feel, and often attribute their creativity not to something that's come from themselves, but to something that's come through them from a greater consciousness. This could indeed be due to a kind of consciousness in nature. And then, in turn, that consciousness in nature could be grounded on a basic ground of the whole universe and of nature itself. There could be a conscious ground of everything.